Good evening and welcome to our special council meeting for Monday, December 20th. Our agenda, first item is call to order. Declaration, pecuniary or non-pecuniary. Is there any in the room this evening? Councillor Saylor.
Thank you, Mayor Van Ryn. Yes, I have conflict of interest with the rec center portion of the budget, so I would request that we had a separate resolution for that section so that I could recuse myself, but still stay in for the rest of the budget.
Thank you very much. Any others? Seeing none, acceptance of the agenda for the special council meeting December 20th, 2021. Any additions to the agenda? Seeing none, can I get someone to make a motion to adopt the agenda? Councillor Beekman, any discussion? All, yes, go ahead.
The discussion would be as amended?
Yes.
Okay.
All those in favor as amended? Carried unanimously, thank you. Moving on to business rising from the minutes, item 4.1. The 2022 budget deliberations by our CFO, Kyle. Kyle, the floor is yours.
Okay, good evening, everybody, and thanks for this meeting. Just kind of a summary of what we talked about the last two special council meetings. So on December 8th, we had the draft capital budget, which we presented and discussed with council. The capital spending for 2022 from that budget is approximately $17.1 million. And on December 15th, we had the draft operating budget, which we presented. The budget was approximately $20.3 million in operating spending for 2022. Under the MGA, council must pass a 3-year operating plan and a 5-year capital plan before the end of the year. Just to summarize on the next steps here, so following council's decision on regarding passing a budget, municipal tax rates will be brought back to council for review and consideration in April and May. So we're not looking at anything specific tax rates, but that's kind of a timeline of the process to finalize this. For the capital budget that we have attached as part of the agenda package, this is the same budget that we had previously presented on December 8th. So we kind of have 3 options for council as part of this. Council can either pass the capital budget as presented. Council can pass the capital budget with any additions or subtractions as council desires. Or council can pass an interim budget for the time being if they feel like they request further information regarding budget deliberations. That way we can pass a budget before the end of the year in return for further deliberations in the new year. As far as the operating budget that we have attached, we just have a few changes from the previous meeting I'd just like to point out. The first one is the $4 million debenture loan for the lagoon upgrades. That was previously included as a 15-year repayment, to which it has been updated as a 10-year repayment. This does result in quicker repayment terms with an increase in debt payments and in turn utility rates to fund those payments. The second being the North Industrial ASP. This was presented to council as a cost of $25,000. However, in the budget it was noted as $50,000. So what we've done is reduce that as part of the budget and ultimately reduces the amount of revenue that we need to draw from operating reserves to fund that project. For council's consideration for the operating budget, again, council can either pass the operating plan as presented. Council can pass the operating plan subject to any additions or subtractions as council desires. Or formally, or third, if council believes they request further information as part of budget deliberations, you have the opportunity to pass a interim budget tonight, and we can reconvene for further budget deliberations in 2022. Financial impact of the budgets that we do have presented to council: a utility rate increase of $6.97 per month for the sewer flat rate charge would be effective for January 2022. This would follow up with a increase of $6.97 per month on that same flat fee effective January 2023. There's no other utility rates presented as utility rate increases presented as part of this budget. If council does proceed to pass the bylaw with those rate increases, we we'll have to have council formalize the rate increases through the utility rate bylaw. Regarding municipal taxes, currently in the draft budget, there is a 1.72% increase in taxes for 2022. And this equates to funding of just over $151,000 to balance the budget. The effect on the tax increase would be a $13.78 increase for every $100,000 in assessed residential property value, and $17.25 for every $100,000 in assessed residential property value on a yearly basis. With that being said, I will turn this back to council for consideration. Any questions they may have?
Thank you, Kyle. I'll open up the floor to any questions for our CFO. Deputy Mayor Avery, go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor Van Ryan. So on page 6 of the presentation, where we've got the operating plan deficit. So if I'm reading that right, we've got a 1.72% this year. Next year it's going to be just over 3% increase in tax. In Europe, that's going to be 5%. Plus we're putting approximately a 5% increase in utilities over the next 2 years. So if I'm reading this right, we're going to be hitting our residents with a tax of approximately 6% this year because of the utility increase, 8% next year, and 10% the year after. So I don't know, like 1.72, 2.19, like I'm looking at the deficit in the operating plan that shows $350,000 in 2023. And then 523,941 in 2024. So I don't know if that's projected growth and it's going to keep the rates down, but I'm not really in favor of what we're being presented because I'm seeing this as a bigger tax increase than what the one page says.
Sure, and I can answer that question. So the figure, so you do have the 151 for 2020, and then as you mentioned, 350 for 23 and 523 for 2024. That net increase is essentially a compounded effect. So I'm just going to put on the screen here, and I'll discuss this for the people watching at home, is that if council passes the budget year this year, so that increased funding of 151 automatically transfers over to the next year and the years after that. So it kind of reduces the compounding effect. So if you're just looking at this as what is the funding required each year once the compounding effect is kind of essentially taken out, you can see we have a draft budget of 1.72% for 2022, 2.19 for 2023, and 1.84 for 2024. So essentially, this 350 grand that we have for 2023, if you pass a budget today that passes the tax increase for 150 grand, that reduces down to $200,000 for next year. Same thing with 2024, that would reduce down by 150 grand because it's the cumulative compounded effect. Does that answer your question?
Any follow-up questions, Jason? Councillor Chapman.
Thank you, Mayor Van Ryan. Through to Kyle, what page is that draft operating budget?
So what I have in front of you is it's not in the staff report, this is just from the presentation from the last budget meeting. This is slide 25 of the PowerPoint from our last meeting.
Okay. If I could just do a follow-up question while I have the floor. On page 3 of tonight's agenda, you're talking about utility rates of $6.97 per month. So that would be effective for this year, or for 2022. And then you're adding another $6.97 on top of that for the following year. Is that correct?
Correct, yeah. So essentially, for a 10-year debenture, just under $14 a month is what would be required to fund the debenture and the increased operating costs. So what we've done to kind of mitigate the increase and help for timing is that we're only going to have half-year debenture payment for next year, and we're only going to have half-year operating costs for the new FTE edition next year. So by essentially splitting that in half for the first year and then doing another increase in 2023, it splits the increase over 2 years there.
Any other questions for our CFO? So I just wanted to make a couple of comments. The carryover from the previous budget and previous council, there are 3 big ticket items on there. The Civic Square, that is on the part of the capital budget at 6.3 million and change. The Northwest Coldell infrastructure upgrade, so that's the new sanitary and water and street improvements to get out to the new rec center, the school, and also for the new residential areas that's coming up. That's $520,000 over budget. And then the rec center is 2.7 million and change. So it went from 13 million to 15,750,000. So if you combine all the cost overruns on those 3 projects that are part of our capital budget that we're looking at tonight is $3,835,530 as part of our capital plan. Also, another carryover is on the capital side of things. For 2022, it shows it at $17,141,259 and $16,493,259 is carryovers from the previous budget. And with the 1.72% tax increase that we're looking at for Coldell, just some comparables to the area. Lethbridge County just passed their budget with a 1.626 budget increase. Cold Lake, 3.2% increase. Parkland County, 2.5%. Devon, 3.9%. Beaumont, 2.4%. Lacombe, 2.7%. Okotoks, 2.5%. And Airdrie at 4.03%. Going at a 1.72, we're going to be below average. So, Councillor Beekman, you got a comment?
Comment on those increases, because if I'm reading it right, so 1.72 would be our percentage increase on the property tax, sewer flat fees, and the gas and electrical franchise fees, which are on top of that. Doing the math on that, we add in that $13.78 per $100,000 on a $300,000 house puts us at $41.34 for the year, $83.64 for the first year on the sewer flat, plus the average of $12 a year on natural gas franchise, $24 a year on electrical franchise puts us around the $160 mark in just tax increases for this year alone, let alone adding on that extra $6.97 a month. So for the following year, which would put us just shy of the $250 mark increase over 2 years. So I guess I'd like to see what we can do to not pass this on to the residents as much, because that's quite a huge jump over a 2-year term in my opinion. So.
Go ahead, Kyle, you got a response?
Yeah, no, great analysis. Kind of touching on them individually. So the utility rate increase, one option council could consider is you could debenture the loan over an increased number of years. That would obviously reduce the funding required on a year-to-year basis to fund that project. Conversely, too, as far as the tax increase on the operating side, if council did want to look at reducing that or changing that, it would come at the cost, though, of potential decreases in funding for various services. I know it's a hard line to budget to manage too, right? But if we reduce funding, it could come at the cost of, maybe a little bit from the parks or facilities of their old budget. So definitely something we could look at and bring back to council. But again, it's a hard balance between the level of services and the funds required to balance it. So kind of that teeter-totter approach there, if that helps add a little perspective to your comment.
That answer your question? Okay. Deputy Mayor Avery.
Mayor Van Ryan. So just continuing on with what Councillor Beekman was saying and Kyle's reply, I would really like to see, because I'm not the expert, but I would really like to see this go back to the experts and see where we can take off 1.7%. It's not a great deal, but it is a great deal to pass on to the taxpayers with everything else, as Councillor Beekman has mentioned, the franchise fees and the utilities. So if we could take this back to the experts, which is the town staff, and where can we maybe move stuff around? Like 2023, we got 1.5 million for roads. Maybe we go 1.2 that year. But I'm not the expert, so I don't know. I don't want to say where it's at. Is this the very best price? Do we need an auger truck? I don't know. Is it cheaper to contract that out? And then does that save the wage because we don't need the extra staff member? This is stuff that I would like the staff to bring back to yourself, not myself, but I would really like to see where we could get the staff to bring back, where can we save 2%?
Yeah, and part of that too, we could look at what ultimately that would entail is we could come back with a couple of suggestions to council. Part of it too would be, for example, we're spending X amount on roads, X amount on water, X amount on parks. If council wants to reduce the tax increase, we can say, we can cut services slightly by this amount and say, each of the departments. Ultimately, we can bring back suggestions, and it is a conversation for the service level that we have, with a possible reduction in parks. That could mean, lower maintenance or reduced times cutting grass, or facilities. It could mean reduced cost added for maintenance of our facilities. But again, if that's council's wish, we could look at options and bring that back to council as part of a kind of a service level discussion, and where council might want to see an adjustment at that time.
Your comment?
Mayor, just a couple of comments just to help provide some information that may help facilitate discussion. If you look at the amortization, like the term of the loan for the wastewater treatment upgrades, for instance, going from a 10 to a 15, the difference is $1.62 per month in year one and another $1.62 in year two, in terms of like what that actually does for the flat rate for residents based on a 15 versus a 10-year term. The 15 would be $1.62 cheaper per month per year. In the operating budget, there was an additional $100,000 that was put away into capital reserve in addition to what was put away last fiscal year. And that represents about a 5% increase to the total amount of money put away into capital savings, which in turn can be used for core infrastructure in the future. So some of the increase is a result of additional saving, which in turn allows you to have more purchasing power for your capital plan long term. And that is a decision for council to decide how much do you want to put away versus how much do you want to spend later. And then the other part, just to look at the data, comparing Coaldale to Tabor, for instance, when it comes to the franchise fees, if we were to have the same franchise fees as the town of Tabor, for instance, we would have enough revenue where you'd be able to look at a tax decrease of 3.5%. So there's diversified revenue streams that we have. There's franchise fees, there's utilities and taxes. But just in terms of looking at Tabor's mill rate, they have the maximum amount that you can charge for franchisees for electrical, for instance, and we're 35% lower than them. And then the city of Lethbridge, another neighbor, their franchise fees for natural gas is 44% higher than Coaldale. So that results in several $100,000 of revenue. And if you were to do something like that, it's just a different way of structuring your revenue streams, then you'd be able to reduce taxes with this existing budget by 3.5%. So just to add a little bit of context so that we are discussing apples to apples. And the last point I'll make is that there was a 0% net increase to residential taxes in the past 3 years. That was that took a lot of diligence in order to cut spending, in order to do that 3 years in a row. And the main reason why that became difficult with each successive fiscal year is that the cost of doing business compounded. Wages increase, the cost of fixed costs increase, and those compound over time, while our revenue stream didn't compound over time with respect to the actual taxes. So just to kind of give you that longer term approach, and I guess one last point, if I may, it's just on the term of the loan. When you look at the long-term capital plan, there are some other critical pieces of infrastructure that will need to be replaced over the next 10 years. And the one benefit from a long-term planning is that although there is more expense now by having a 10-year amortization for the lagoons, you get that loan off the books, and it allows you to add another loan for another critical piece of infrastructure in our utilities, such as the potable water reservoir, without having to make the payments of 2 loans at the same time. So if you want to look at the taxpayer, like over a 10-year period, the most expensive option for utilities would be having to pay 2 of those loans of that size at the same time. So hopefully you can get one off the books before adding another. So just a couple little notes that I made just to help facilitate discussion. And
So correct me if I'm wrong, if we start playing with the franchise fees, we're just going to be taxing on the other end instead of taxing on the residential side. Raising those franchise fees is not going to fix it because we're still going to pay it in the end. So Kyle, go ahead.
Just like to add a point to Mayor Van Ryn, you talked about the tax increases in other municipalities, comparables and whatnot. The $200,000 decrease in the MSI operating that Town of Coaldale is seeing, I just want to make it clear that's not a provincial-wide standard where every town and city is experiencing the same decrease. That's a kind of a specific to Coaldale for this year based on our growth. So we do have other municipalities similar to us that are maintaining their MSI operating revenue, increasing taxes. Should the Town of Coaldale have not had that decrease, we would have been bringing a surplus budget in a sense back to council with all the tax increase. So one of the ways to unfortunately offset that $200,000 loss is to, partly raise taxes to help fund those services, or again, we have to look at service adjustments and possible reductions to offset that loss expense or that loss revenue, as unfortunately there wasn't anything that we could have done about that to mitigate that.
And then again, it's important to understand too that the bulk of this capital budget is a carryover from the previous budget. So there's not much that we can do with those. The only way we can decrease the capital component is if we go through some of these projects again to see if we can cut something out. So I'm going to pick on Kyle here for a sec. One capital item is the pathways for the second phase. So there are $490,000 requested for that.
You're looking at the pathways phase 2? Yes, so that's definitely it's just that's a project that should council wish to put on hold or in sense postpone until further reevaluated. That wouldn't change ultimately the impact on taxes that we're looking at today. That would again put $250,000 into a bank account that we could use on future capital projects that could help mitigate potential future utility increases or future tax increases to help replenish those reserves as needed for future capital projects. So that is a good example of kind of the long-term planning that you do have at your discretion for council today to consider. regarding the 2022 operating budget, that that wouldn't necessarily affect the funds required to balance the budget. But again, it is a great example of how a lot of these projects are in here. Some of them have been previously approved by council, and some of them are kind of placeholders in place. So while it does say a $50 million budget for the plan, anything past 2023 is essentially not locked in stone. You do have the ability as the council to, and you should look at all these projects and evaluate them whether they're the best alternative to council or for the town of Coaldale.
So Deputy Mayor Avery, like, staff has gone through this with meticulously already, so I'm not sure what you're trying to get at as far as where we can cut. Like, we went through everything line item by line item.
And I appreciate that, Mayor Van Ryan, but there's also, like, there's capital and there's operational. So is there, so, you know, as Kyle says, is there some way where you can cut back a little bit to keep, you know, and I don't, like, I'm not the expert, I'm not. So I'm just asking the question because I know we will be asked.
Yeah, so for example, I'll just provide an example to provide some context to it. Currently in our roads budget, you know, we have $95,000 for paving and patching, and, you know, $100,000 for snow removal, and various other amounts for sidewalk repair and line replacements, and same thing with utilities. We have funds in the budget for water line breaks and maintenance and stuff like that. Parks, we do have funds in the budget for construction of our various parks projects and cutting grass. For facilities, we have, you know, funds to add repairs and maintenance for, say, the arena when those items do break or do need maintenance. If we're looking at ways to save $150,000 and reduce the tax increase, what that would entail is looking at those expenses that are more tied directly to the operation and maintenance of our, you know, hard infrastructure, and possibly reducing those. So that can save some taxing. That can definitely save the taxes there. But the trade-off is, you know, maybe there's slightly less money available for patching, or slightly less money available for parks maintenance or facilities maintenance. So it just comes that kind of trade-off balance as part of a service level. If council does wish, again, we can discuss that with the department heads. But again, it ultimately does result in potential reductions in services, across which departments those may be.
So on the operational side, I'm just going to run through a few of these ones that we reviewed with a price tag on them, and then we can discuss them further. So the records management project that was spoken to, that was a $40,000 price tag. The video time stamping of our live streams, that's $6,500 upfront for this year, and then $4,750 every year after that. Emergency services, the grate over the concrete swale, that was a $20,000 budget item. Kate Andrews Fire Academy summer internship, where they want to have 2 students from Kate Andrews work part-time, that was a $6,000 price tag. The e-ticketing system that's required by the province for the photo radar program is a $10,000 price tag that we have to do. The Bylaw officer safety dispatch system, that's a $10,000 a year tax support, and that's for officer safety, so we need to have that. The fire master plan to take a look at hiring a consulting firm to work with the town of Coaldale's emergency services to take a look at what our growth is going to be in the northwest and west Coaldale. So that's a $50,000 price tag. We have in operations a curb stop replacement program. It's a $10,000 price tag yearly for that one. The alley replacement program, that's $75,000 a year. The storm pond dredging at the Kinship Park, there's those 2 water features with the fountains. They want to dredge those. That's a $35,000 price tag. The fire hydrant replacement program, that's $48,000 a year that we require tax support for that. And then under the engineering, we need a budget for $50,000. Future water reservoir, a $9 million price tag in the next 4. Little transportation study, that's a $50,000 price tag to look into the pedestrian overpass or enhance connectivity. And then planning and development, Main Street supplies, they want to increase the budget to stuff available on Main Street. Also, Coaldale Industrial Area Structure Plant, so that's that future industrial park that tag. Parks and Recreation, they want to add one more, and that's a $55,000 budget request, and that basically to look after our 100 of green space, path for a $5,000 budget item every year. The mountain bike park maintenance, that's $10,000 a year budget item. And the library, $10,000 budget item for doing some work in an enclosed area with plexiglass. And those are the budget, or I'm sorry, the operational budget side of things. So I think that we can do without. I'd like to speak on that, have you speak on that now. Councillor Chapman.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Van Ryn. I think we talked about this last meeting about the $10,000 just as a small, tiny little thing for the e-ticketing, and I believe we can move that into its own funding rather than tax supported. So that'd be one item we can take off the table right there.
If I could just speak to that, with that being kind of a necessity for the Fuller Radar program, even though it's funded through Fuller Radar and not tax support, that unfortunately wouldn't have any impact on the bottom line of the budget. It's still, again, our Fuller Radar revenue doesn't change whether or not we have this program. We're simply adding additional expenses that, you know, while it may be funded through the Fuller Radar, it means there's another $10,000, say, in bylaw wage expense or whatnot that would have to be covered through tax support. So the net effect is it's still the same thing, unfortunately.
Kaylin.
Chair to Councillor Chapman. If the desire of council were to reduce or absorb that $10,000 expense for the software for photo radar, my recommendation would be to replace it with an expense, such as reducing the amount that gets put away for the photo radar grant. The community grant, for instance, which is funded from a subset of photo radar revenue. That would be the way that you could absorb that expense, is just by reducing the grant amount by that same cost.
And a question for our CFO, that $10,000, would that make any effect on what we're trying to reduce here?
The net tax implications of that. That would be approximately 0.11%.
Okay, Deputy Mayor Avery, any?
And Ryan, I'm not the expert, but, if you reduce some of those contracts by half or consultants by half, you got $75,000. If you prorate the employees, if they're not hired till, July, halfway through the year, you could be looking at another $70,000 if they're not hired. So there's your 150 right there in just, consulting fees and those wages, depending on when the staff start. Do you need someone to mow the lawn in January, or do you need someone to mow the lawn in May? Is it something that you can get in a student or step program? I don't know. I'm not the expert in that. That funding could have been cut as well. But I believe there's ways, because as soon as a consulting firm knows you got $50,000 to do a project, they're going to bid $49,999. So, if you bid 25, are you going to get the same product? If you write the scope of your tender right, you should get the same scope for that same price, or half the price.
Excellent points. What if, for example, we're talking about the contracted services with these studies, the budget for those could be reduced, and you could have essentially additional funds you could put towards a mill rate stabilization for this year, which would reduce the tax impact. Part of that, though, is when looking at 2023 and 2024, we're just kind of kicking the can down the road, and that those funds would still be required for future years. The risk of that is it could potentially lead to higher tax increases in future years rather than spread out over the various years. So that is a good solution to solve it for 2022. But again, it does have an impact for future years. One other point I just might want to add is we did have the workshop on asset management too. Part of the things that as our community grows and we do have more capital infrastructure that needs to be added or replaced, proper asset management will look at the maintenance required for these projects and look at the maintenance required for these assets to keep them sustainable for their expected long-term life. So by investing part of the capital budget into the asset management of these programs, the hope and the result is that it would ultimately reduce the long-term infrastructure needs and capital requirements. So by investing today as part of the operating budget into the maintenance of your parks, facilities, and roads, the hope is that we'll reduce the long-term capital cost of these assets in future years as well.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor Van Ryn. So thanks, Kyle, for that. I'll go back to our road and deep utility replacement program. If we put that down to $1.2 million instead of 1.5, we're going to cover our tax increase for those years, and plus CAO Hastings noted that we're putting an extra $100,000 aside for deep roads. So actually we got 1.3 each year to do those projects. So I really believe there's a way of doing it without doing a tax increase over the next 2 or 3 years. It's just going to be tight, but the economy is tight.
Great comment too. Yeah, and it's just kind of a trade-off. It's we could reduce the cost of those capital. What it ultimately means is you're taking funds previously allocated to capital reserves and using those for the operating budget, which as a council you do have the option as well. It just ultimately reduces the future long-term costs associated with capital replacement. So it does solve the operating budget we are discussing today. Again, just kind of the trade-off approach. The trade-off to that is you could have reduced funding for future capital infrastructure depending on the future needs. So there's a good example. But again, I'm just kind of pulling off the trade-offs that would come with that as well.
Follow up, Deputy Mayor. Okay, Councillor Chapman.
Thank you, Mayor Van Ryn, and through to Kyle. I might just say to the past that my experience at the table with your budgeting and planning for the following years have been really not only spot on, but as it turns out, your budget costs we've never had to meet that budget. In fact, many times over, the budgets come in 10-20% less, so there are savings when it comes down to that. So just give you praise for that in the past. So I'm just hoping that we can experience the same thing in 2022, and this is very difficult mainly because a lot of these things are compounding and coming up on us very, very fast, and I don't see really any wiggle room in order to, cut some costs somewhere, unless snow removal, for example, you can budget one way and hopefully have a really mild winter that creates a lot of savings in another way. And then, of course, like I don't see us saving, cutting on alleys, because that gets away on us, and then it'll be twice as expensive to repair them in the future. That's just one example.
Yeah, no, excellent comment. And, sometimes in the year there are budget savings. Like if we do have the snow removal isn't as large as required, there could be savings in 1 year. One important thing to consider, though, is it's a good priority or idea to kind of keep that funding allocated consistently over what you may expect over a number of years. For example, if the snow removal came in 50 grand 1 year and compared to our 100 grand budget, and you decide to decrease it because we have the savings, and the next year it could be higher, right? So there's just some uncertainties associated with it. We do make estimates every year for what we're going to require for some of our essentially non-discretionary expenses, such as our utilities and our insurance and WCB and whatnot, a number of those programs. So we do believe that we estimate fairly closely to what those services are going to come by. Ultimately, if there are any, potential savings identified between now and setting of the mill rate, we can bring those back to council for potentially amending the budget for that. But again, from administrative and the budget perspective, we do budget fairly close to what we think we will have. So while there is the opportunity for that, I don't project them to be of any significance at this standpoint, or else we would just reduce them now.
Okay, thank you. So just to recap then, we're looking at a 1.72% tax increase, and we're looking at the utility rate bylaw that will need to be amended for the sanitary flat fee of $6.97 per month for 2022, and then an additional $6.97 per month starting in January of 2023 to pay for that $4 million debenture loan that we need as part of the aerated lagoon upgrade. We have no say in the matter in the sense that we were mandated by the province of Alberta to upgrade to meet the current standards. So we don't have an option for that. It's a ribbon in former council's hats for not having a tax increase in the last 3 years, and when I was on council previous, we were lucky enough to have a couple of years too with no tax increases. But Coaldale is growing leaps and bounds, and we need to be able to keep up with it, because the last thing we want is to try and cut this budget, and then next year it's going to come and bite us in the butt because we didn't take into account that we needed to do this and we needed to do that. And I totally appreciate Deputy Mayor Abree's comments, but I have every confidence in our administrative staff that they brought this to us as bare bone as possible. And like I said in my opening remarks, there's almost over $3.8 million carryover in cost overruns on the Civic Square, the Rec Center, and the Northwest Coaldale that we have no control over, but we have to pay for it now. So our options are to pass the operating and capital plans as presented, or council can pass the operating and capital plans with additions or subtractions, which we've just discussed, or we can pass an interim operating and capital plan. So I'm going to open up to the floor to see if anybody wants to sponsor one of those, please. Councillor Saylor.
Mayor Van Ryn, I'd like to make a motion for option number 3, keep it how it is, and then hopefully early in the year or something, we find some grants or find somewhere that we can hopefully not increase the taxes, but I'd say that we keep it how it is and keep our fingers crossed.
So you're talking option number 1.
Option 3, pass the intern and then hope that we find some funding by March, April. If we don't, then we continue as is. If we find the funding, then we can change it.
Kyle.
Just in regards to that, for option 3 would essentially entail additional budget deliberations in January, February. In regards to your comment of like, hopefully we find cost savings and whatnot, that always remains an option that you do have as a council up until May, when you actually have to pass the mill rate. So if council does approve a tax increase now, that's not actually affecting people's wallets until May, right? Does that help with that?
Clarifies it, thank you.
So which option would you like to do then?
I would like to change it to option 1, pass the budget as presented.
Okay, so option number 1 is that to pass the operating and capital plans as presented. Any further discussion?
Sorry, Mayor Van Ryn.
Yes, go ahead.
Just regards to Councillor Saylor's
Yes.
interest.
We'll split those out.
Okay.
Okay. And Deputy Mayor Avery had a comment or a question?
Just for clarification, if I can ask the CFO. So if our assessment rate goes up 2%, does that mean we're going to have a 2% assessment increase as well as a 1.7% tax increase, or are we going to work those so we balance it out that it's 1.7%?
Correct. So in the budget, we have looked at new assessment, but inflation does happen with people's properties, right? So if inflation goes up, say 2%, and you pass a 1.72% budget increase, the mill rate will actually go down by the difference between the two.
Councillor Chapman.
Mayor Van Ryn, and in speaking in favor of option number 1, just through to Kyle again. So with this capital plan, that'll be putting into reserves for all the capital items that would be you'd be predicting or planning for over the next 3 years. For example, some of the equipment for the town shop, particularly.
Yeah, so in regards to 2022, that would essentially formalize those capital items. Anything 2023 and above, it is included in this budget kind of as a placeholder to give council somewhat of an idea of what's coming down the pipe in future years. It's, again, not set in stone, so all those items will be brought back to council for consideration again is once we do these budget deliberations next year. So you're not locked into anything for 2023.
Councillor Beekman.
Thank you, Mayor. Just for clarification, as I'm a little just follow suit with what our 2021 plan was, right?
That is an option too. You could pass the, there's a lot of, well, sorry, I'll backtrack there. There's a lot of differences between our 2021 and 2022 plan. So an interim plan would essentially just be passing the budget you see in front of you today before the end of the year. And then that essentially just signals that we're going to have budget deliberations in the new year to possibly amend that or whatnot.
Okay, so passing an interim budget would be passing this budget tentatively with alterations coming?
Yes.
Essentially. Okay,
Yep.
Thank you.
With that being said, though, that any budget that we pass could be tweaked if need be in the new year as well. So, okay, so just to ask Councillor Saylor if he would just like to sponsor the passing of the operating budget. And then we'll split out the capital budget separately because you'll have to abstain for that one.
Okay, yes, so I'd like to option 1 for the for the capital budget, or
No,
operating budget, sorry, yes. I'd like to make it for the operating budget.
Okay, so just to confirm, you're going to make a motion to pass the operating budget.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Any further discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? Councillor Beekman, Councillor Avery, opposed. Thank you. Motion's carried. And then Councillor Saylor, if I could get you to leave council chambers, please. Okay, then I'm looking for a sponsor for a motion to pass the capital budget as presented. Councillor Reese? Oh,
Excuse me, Mayor. I just want to clarify that the intent is to ask for a resolution for the capital budget for the multi-use rec center, just for
Oh,
that
I'm sorry.
project specific, just to clarify, make sure I have that correctly.
okay. So then, read the motion to me that it should be then with a price tag then?
That council approve the revised capital budget for the multi-use recreation center at the all-inclusive total of $15,750,000.
Okay. Councillor Reese, can you accept that friendly amendment? Okay. So does everybody understand the intent of the motion then? Go ahead, Councillor Pickering.
So when he's readjusting that to 15,750,000, what happens in the next 6 months if this jumps or runs over budget more?
I'll let our CAO answer that.
Excellent question, Councillor Pickering. As staff, we would have to bring that back to council with an update based on any additional overruns. This is the revised budget based on the best information that we have at the time. There's a possibility that it can still go up. There's also a possibility that it can go down.
That answer your question, Councillor Pickering? Okay, so Councillor Chapman, go ahead.
Maybe through to CAO Hastings or our CFO, there is a contingency fund built into that, is that not right? Is there a contingency fund?
Yes, that's correct. And the other point I should add, just to augment my response to Councillor Pickering, there's a number of deletable line items within the project that we could also bring forward to council. So you could either look at increasing the budget to pay for the full scope as it's been currently planned for, or council could look at phasing or deleting items in order to stay on budget without actually increasing it again, as just another for instance.
And then, Kalen, if you could just read back the amended motion.
Certainly, that council approve the revised capital budget for the multi-use recreation center for the all-inclusive total of $15,750,000.
There's a Deputy Mayor Avery, go ahead.
Mayor Van Ryan, so just for clarity, Kalen, is the 2.75 million additions? Is it overruns and project? We're quite a high percentage if it's overrun on tenders.
Great question. As a result of tender 2, the steel framing package, that was $700,000 alone, just for that one line item. There's also $1.4 million within this total of $15,750,000. The corresponding revenue stream for that expense of $1.4 million would be through the fundraising. So this is not necessarily all tax dollars balancing this 15.75. 1.4 of that total would be on items that are being fundraised for.
That answer your question, Deputy Mayor Avery?
So really, it's only an increase of 350,000 and not, so, well, like, if we approve this, are we going to be using this 15.7 million plus $1.4 million. So now we're at a $17 million rec complex. Or are we going to build a 13 with $700,000 overrun and then 1.5 million? So I'm just not quite getting, because we're using our fundraising as a revenue stream, but we're still looking for an extra $2.75 million plus 1.4. So now we got a $17 million project, not a 15.7. So I don't know, these numbers just are not making sense to me.
I can maybe add to that, in regards to the fundraising and funding for the deletable items and whatnot. So the kind of those are the equipment required, like equipment to operate the facility and some of the other nice to have items. Those items were, the intention was to fund those items through the fundraising. When the fundraising project was first brought up or first discussed, there was some uncertainty as to what that would actually get us, right? Would that become 200 grand, or would that be $1 million, or 1.4? Now that we have a little more clarity on where we anticipate that figure to be, we can specifically allocate those to the nice to have or the add-on items as part of that, if that helps add it. So it's not a $17 million budget if you're kind of looking at the 15.7 plusing the add-ons. The 15.75 kind of includes those deletable items and some of the nice to haves as part of the facility.
You're good, Deputy Mayor? Okay, so there's a motion on the floor to pass the revised budget of $15,750,000 for the multi-use rec center by Councillor Reese. Any more discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? Deputy Mayor Abry and Beekman oppose. Motion's carried. Okay, can we call back in Councillor Saylor, please? So now the last item to discuss is the revised capital budget. Is there a sponsor for that motion? Councillor Chapman. You'll make that motion? Any further discussion on the capital budget as revised? Call the question. All those in favor? Opposed?
Am I supposed to vote on this section then, or?
Yes, you can vote
Oh,
on
I
this-
just don't.
on this
Okay,
piece.
sorry.
Yes.
My apologies.
This has nothing to do with the rec center.
Oh, okay. That's why I
Okay.
was confused. My apologies.
Go ahead, Kalen.
Just for additional clarity, council may wish to amend the motion to just insert into the resolution itself, excluding the multi-use recreation center. Even though it says, revised, and it's obviously implied by the minutes, you could just make it explicit and put it right into the resolution if you wish, Councillor Chapman.
Okay, so there's a motion on the floor. Any further discussion? Again, I'll call the question. All those in favor of the passing the capital budget as amended, excluding the multi-use rec center? All those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried. Against is Councillor Beekman, Pickering, and Deputy Mayor Abry. Thank you. Moving on. Yes. Okay, we're going to move on to item 7.1, the utility rate bylaw. That's on page 15 of your agenda package.
Okay, so we have the utility rate bylaw number 838-C-12-21. So as part of the operating budget to which council approved, this does include a utility rate increase for 2022 and 2023 to fund the funding for the debenture loan for the lagoon for over a 10-year amortization period, as well as the added utility operator position that will start middle of 2022 and going forward. So as part of the budget and the adjustments you'll see in this utility rate bylaw, the sanitary sewer flat fee has increased by $6.97 per month, effective January 1st, 2022. And this will again increase by $6.97 per month, effective January 1st, 2023. Going through the bylaw here, so council will see the changes highlighted in yellow, which some of them are kind of an academic point for the wording. But again, as far as a rate increase, council will see them on page 19 of your agenda package, and again followed on page 20 of your agenda package. There's no other increases complemented or contemplated as part of this. That being said, we'll turn it back to council for any questions or discussions they may have.
Deputy Mayor Avery.
Thank you, Mayor Van Ryn. I would like to move first reading of utility bylaw 838-C-12-21.
Any further discussion? All those in favor of first reading? Carried unanimously. Thank you. And then can I get someone to sponsor? Councillor Beekman, go ahead.
Or that council proceed with second reading of utilities bylaw 838-C-12-21.
Any further discussion? All those in favor? Oh, Councillor Chapman?
Yeah, thank you. I was just trying to be catching up with myself here, Mayor Van Ryn through to Spence or Kyle. The meter replacement costs for anything above 2-inch meters. So you have a 15% cost increase. Could you explain why that would have to be added to a larger meter size as opposed to the other ones?
Sorry, could you just direct me to which page which one you're looking at?
Page 23 of 25. I think for the commercial side, you've got twice in there. Page.
Which specific point? Sorry, Councillor Chapman.
8.23.
Okay.
So there's a setup fee as opposed to some of the other ones, and I think is that because of the digital or radio readout?
I can't comment specifically on why there is that charge. My understanding would be that, a 2-inch water meter is quite a substantial piece, and we don't have a lot of those in town. I think only maybe half a dozen businesses do have them. I'm assuming the markup is just due to the additional staff time required to get that meter installed. That is just kind of my best guess, but I can't provide any specifics, unfortunately, for that.
Okay, thanks.
Go ahead, Kalen.
Our CFO's best guess is correct. The intent of the rate structure here is to recover cost. And was based, I was concerned that there was an amendment that we put in here, but this is just carryover language from the previously approved bylaw. But if you're asking for information purposes, the general principle with the rates that are in here for installs, the intent is to cover any costs, so it's not being subsidized by the taxpayer. Thank you.
Okay, so there's a motion on the floor by Councillor Beekman. Any further discussion? All those in favor of second reading? Carried unanimously. Thank you. Now I need someone to sponsor to provide unanimous consent to provide third reading of the utility rates bylaw 838-C-12-21. Councillor Reese, any further discussion? All those in favor? Carried unanimously. And last but not least, that council proceed with third reading of utility rates bylaw 838-C-12-21. Can I have a sponsor for that, please? Councillor Chapman, any further discussion? All those in favor? Carried unanimously. Thank you very much. And that brings us okay, so that concludes 7.1, and we're ready for motion for adjournment. Councillor Saylor, any discussion? All those in favor? Carried. Thank you very much.